Scaling in Fragile States. My name is Jonathan Papalides. I'm the Executive Director of Fragile States for World Vision and co-chair of this group on scaling in fragile states. I want to say a little bit about the community of practice for those who are new to it, and a little bit about our group as we start our time together. And then it'll be my pleasure to introduce Rob Chase, who is our new co-chair for the group from the World Bank. And Rob will give us a bit of the run of show and take us into a bit of discussion around some of your interests and priorities. So the community of practice is now in its 5th annual workshop. We started off with, I think, about 4 or 5 working groups, and we are now at 9 groups, covering a wide variety of perspectives, geographies, thematic issues, ranging from climate change and social enterprise to agriculture, monitoring and evaluation, and of course our group. The COP is completely voluntary and free of charge. And so we're really just driven by the motivation to learn and exchange knowledge on the practice of scaling and how we do it. There's been a lot of attention on innovation in many of the circles that we work in, but comparatively less so in scaling. And so this community of practice has really been driven by a desire to build sort of a core group in the industry to really focus on scaling issues. If you are new to the group, we extend a very special invitation to you to join us, join the working groups that we're involved in. And we're only as strong as our membership. So we really are looking for active contributors in this space. In terms of the fragility group itself, I think it's we've been sort of one of the earlier groups in this. Larry Cooley, who is with us today, welcome Larry, and co-creator obviously of the community of practice, together with me, started the fragility group early on. And our membership is a really good cross-section of the community of practice itself. So we have multilateral institution represented, bilateral donors, foundations, think tanks, universities, and NGOs. So, and it's increasingly sort of global in reach. So representing the Global South and various others. The key issues that we've been looking at, especially over the last couple of years, have centered around what is it that makes scaling different and difficult in fragile places. So what are the particular obstacles that we've been trying to get our heads around as a community to really try to excel in these spaces? There's been a particular interest in the group around the nexus issues. How do we scale across the sort of the relief and peace and development paradigm? How do we strengthen institutions and systems as we scale in these places? And also mobilize diverse sources of financing from the capital markets and donors through blended financing instruments. We've also been looking at politically savvy ways of doing this work, which is very important. Increasingly a focus on adaptive work. And if anybody joined the session that Larry did a few days ago with Alistair McKechnie, who's with us, has been a great member of the group as well as the community of practice, and Rob and others, it was a fascinating look at sort of the adaptive elements which are central to scaling, especially in fragile places. So we've been looking at a kind of a cross-section of these types of issues. And later on, Rob will take us through an exercise to sort of see what your interests are coming into this process. So let me go ahead and introduce Rob, and then we can go to his segment, and then he'll give us also a broader set of what we'll do in the second hour as well. Rob Chase is the practice manager of social protection and jobs in the East Africa region for the World Bank. So he's working directly in some very fragile situations, really at that so-called nexus, dealing with vulnerable groups and governments, working through crises, trying to help strengthen livelihood prospects for those countries and societies, build strong, scalable, and adaptive safety nets as well. And Rob has had quite a distinguished and seasoned career within the World Bank. Prior to this role, he was the lead for strategy in the vice presidency for country systems, advice, and operations policy. He's had postings in Ethiopia and India. He's led communities of practice on social capital, which is a major interest to many of us in the fragility group as it connects to resilience. He's done other work on community-driven development. And before all that, he was a faculty member in the economics department of School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and he did his PhD in economics at Yale University. I've been particularly delighted to have Rob on board. It's still early days as the co-chair, but already he's contributed so much to how we think about these issues and has some great ideas for how the group can structure itself moving forward. I would also be remiss not to thank Larry Cooley for being the co-chair of this group since the beginning. Larry, I can assure you, is not stepping away from the interest in fragility. It's just that he's, I think, a little bit busy with curating the entire community of practice and leading the monitoring and evaluation group as well. But Larry and I are working on a second paper right now on adaptive scaling in fragile places, and we'll be coming to this group in short order for some thoughts and early feedback on it. So with that, welcome Rob formally to the group. This is your first session, and I'll turn it over to you for the next bit.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for the intro, and particularly thanks to Larry for inviting me to be part of this group. I'd been participating sort of at a less intense way in the community of practice for a couple of years, and was really, really taken with the types of conversations that one can have when you step outside of one's narrow sort of institutional boundaries and thinks broadly about these challenges of scaling up. And given what Jonathan said, that I'm currently working in East Africa and the Horn and down to Mozambique, I spend a fair amount of time thinking about working in fragile states, and so really look forward to opening a conversation with the people in this working group, and particularly with Jonathan and Larry, but more broadly in this discussion about how do we address some of these really crucial issues about fragility and institutional weakness, and the ways in which that hinders our opportunities to address crises. And obviously, some of the crises we're dealing with in the Horn have to do with political and locust and climate change crises, but obviously we're globally trying to address some of the issues about how to deal with COVID, and very, very pleased in the second part of this discussion to have Pallavi come in and give a nice talk that we hope will spur even more discussion about how, in dealing with some COVID response issues, we also need to be aware of some of the institutional ways that in fragile states and in times of crises, we need to adjust accordingly. To some extent, having participated in the plenary that Larry organized a week ago on how to do adaptive management, we are all living that. And part of the adaptive management that I'm keen to work with you all on is how do we build a community of practice that's based on conversation, on open trust, on discussion, in a setting where we're staring at, well, I'll speak for myself. I'm staring at my iPad in the basement of my house, and would much prefer to have the opportunity to meet you all face to face. And so that lack of meeting you as a working group face to face is a shame. The positive is that it does mean that we hope we'll be able to broaden to a larger group of folks who may not be able to come to a physical location, oftentimes on the East Coast of the United States. And so I'm hoping that we'll be able to use that advantage to start about some of the issues that this group would like to talk about and how we should open that. So to give you the short version of show, we're going to spend half an hour or so, and for that I really look forward to having people be as helpful as possible in raising their hand and being part of the conversation when talking about what are their specific interests or issues that they are keen to talk about, but also to have the working group consider. So the first half, or next 30 minutes or so, will be discussing what are the issues that really animates those who are in the room at the moment. And we have a quick survey, a Mentimeter poll, where you'll each be asked to raise a hand and describe some of the issues, or first be counted for what issues are particularly interesting to you as part of this working group. And then with that, we'll use that to spur invitations for people to come and speak, or to take the mic, as it were, and highlight the issues that they'd like this working group to focus on. And then we're very, very pleased to have Pallavi Roy in the second half of the hour, or excuse me, the second half of the session, which is to say from about 45 minutes from now, to be talking, to be giving this talk, and then we'll have more discussion of that. So Jonathan, unless there are other housekeeping issues, I think I'll ask Teresa and the Global Events Management team to put up those 4 objectives or areas of interest that you and Larry designed for this working group. So if you could share that screen, Teresa, that would be great. So as I said, this is an opportunity for people to highlight what they're interested in and talk about what they want to get out of this working group. Because as Jonathan said, and as Larry has said before, this community of practice is about us. It's about the participation of those who choose to opt in. And we want to make sure that we are speaking to the issues that are of greatest interest to you. Now, if Jonathan mentioned that I was previously on the faculty at Johns Hopkins and used to do, and still to some extent do, econometric surveys. This is not, if I were to be sort of partitioning the space, these questions are certainly not, there's a fair amount of overlapping in these questions. But what I'd like for people to do, as I'll go through each of these 4 questions, I'd like you to raise your hand for only one of these 4 areas of what the objectives are of the working group. Now, we fully recognize that these are overlapping, and that good work on scaling up in fragile states will of course involve working on all 4 of these objectives. But it's as much to get a feeling for the areas of those people who are in the room right now that are of particular interest. And then I'd invite people to raise their hand and speak after we do the poll, to raise their hand and then be asked to contribute to what they'd like to work on in particular. So which of the following issues, here we'll start. And there is, on your Zoom call, there's the opportunity to raise, and would like you to push the button that says raise hand. And that then will allow our global events management team, to the folks behind the curtain, as it were, to keep track of how people are responding. So when you think of the thing that most animates you about joining this working group, one of the areas or objectives is applying scaling up approaches to bridge humanitarian development interventions. I'm going to read through them once and then ask you each to reply. Applying scaling up approaches to bridge humanitarian development interventions. A is elaborating on the obstacles to scaling in fragile states and how they have been overcome, or when scaling should not have been attempted. C is promoting adaptive, resilient, and politically smart methods for scaling. And D is examining ways to strengthen country institutions and mobilize the private sector. Mobilize private sector finance for sustainable scaling in a range of fragile contexts. So now let's go through and sort of take hands. So who feels that who in the room feels that the thing that is highest priority for them is applying scaling of approaches to bridge humanitarian and development interventions? And so if you could button to say hands up, and then we'll have Teresa do the count on that. Okay, so got the count on that, and then we'll do who thinks of B, elaborating on the obstacles to scaling in fragile states and how they have been overcome, or when scaling should not have been attempted. So that's B. Okay, hands down. And then C is promoting adaptive, resilient, and political smart methods for scaling. And so hands up for that option if that's really what animates you most. Okay, great, so hands down. And then finally, examining ways to strengthen country institutions and mobilize private sector finance for sustainable scaling in a range of fragile contexts. Okay. Thank you for that. Given who we have in the room, there was a reasonably consistent set of hand raises. So on A, applying scaling up to bridge humanitarian and development, there were 3 people who raised their hands. Obstacles to scaling in fragile states and how they have been overcome, there are 4 people who have raised their hands. On the option C, promoting adaptive, resilient, and politically smart methods, there were 6 people who raised their hands. So that's our plurality, that's our winner at the moment. And then examining ways to strengthen country institutions, there were 4. So there's a pretty even spread across each of those objectives, but this is as much as you probably get people in the working to think it, to speak a bit about what they're most interested in. And so I can now see whether or not, as I put forward these objectives that were the sort of stated objectives of what the working group will do, whether there were reactions or examples or particular ideas that people in the working group were keen to have a discussion of, or what really is an area that, as we're working together on thinking about scaling up in fragile settings, were there issue areas that were of particular interest to you? And so I invite you now to raise your hand, and then when you do, we can have our tech people sort of unmute your mic so we can have your input and thoughts on that. And may use the prerogative of the chair to call on some of the people who I know have things to say on this. Jonathan, any thoughts on who you like to call out on this one? Thanks, Larry. So if you could, Teresa, if you can unmute Larry, that would be great.
And then I would suggest that perhaps Dara could say something afterwards, just to tee you up a little bit there. Dara, I think you do some interesting work in this space.
So I could easily have raised my hand for any one of the 4. The reason I picked the one that 5 others picked is because I think there's this is not an advocacy group, but I think we can have an advocacy function on this. And that was the one that had the most sort of interventionist edge to it. I think that this COVID thing is kind of a teachable moment, as I've talked to each of you about, and there's kind of fragile states was already teaching us a little bit, but I actually think that there's a chance for a pretty significant breakthrough in the way that donor agencies engage on these issues. I'm not sure what direction it will come out, but I think a lot of people recognize where they are is not okay on this. And because this group at its best doesn't have a dog in the fight, just has a lot of people who are interested and committed to trying to find solutions to this. And because I think we tend to work on the management and structural issues just because of who we are, because we're looking at obstacles to scaling. It seems to me if we could find our voice, the group is in a pretty good position to help influence the debate around intervention in these places from a scaling point of view, and have it be seen as a relatively neutral friend in court in trying to encourage action by different parties on the issues. That's why I picked that one.
No, thanks, Larry.
Just to say one other thing, because I think it links directly. the work Jonathan and I have been doing, which I really have from the beginning thought of this group as a handmaiden with. It's really, this has been sort of the peer group we've used for doing that, is exploring what the obstacles are. But I'm hoping we can sort of spin the discussion of obstacles and special characteristics into something that's got kind of a little bit of a normative twist in terms of what agencies might do to confront those obstacles.
Thanks, Larry, and that's very helpful. And for those of you who are new to the group, and if you haven't had the chance to read through some of the work that Larry and Jonathan have done on this, I think it's, I guess, insofar as Jonathan gave a nice plug to what my career has done, I really wanted to give a plug for that work. It's a nice piece that I think summarizes a series of issues about social capital and institutions and how one scales up, particularly in fragile states. So it's quite provocative, and it's nice to hear that it came out of the kinds of conversations that have happened in the working group. So on my list, I have Alistair, who gratefully, I'm great that thanks for volunteering, and then we'll ask if Dara would like to have something to say. So Alistair, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, John, and thanks to you guys for organizing this. I voted for 3, for the third one, the option C, which actually does have a lot of overlap with the others to some extent, so they're not exclusive. And I think the reason I did that is, first, I think the political side of scaling up is really important. I mean, fragility at its core is essentially a political problem. I mean, it's about the relations between state, society, and so on, about the distribution of power and economic rents and so on. And these are political issues. Secondly, I think really critical to scaling up is how you institutionalize it. It's not just identifying champions and working with them. It's actually how do you mobilize support, mobilize people to actually create the organizational, the institutional basis for scaling up and keeping it moving to the future. And I think the third point I would make is that it's also central to a kind of evolutionary model of scaling up, of reaching scale. And if you look at how natural and other systems scale up, it's really through a process of innovation, adaptation, some selective mechanism, and then this gets translated into new ways of going forward. And I've just been reading something about military strategy and how someone said military doctrine is written in blood. I mean, you essentially have mistakes, errors, learning, adaptation, and which side learns and adapts fastest is the one that usually succeeds. And I think applying these kinds of models to scaling up is really critical if we want to institutionalize it and make it sustainable. Thank you.
Alistair, thanks for that. I think that's a nice insight. And also when one thinks about strategy, I mean, particularly at this current moment, there is a conversation about sort of, the fog of war, of how do you don't have enough information, you don't have as much capacity to act as you would like, and yet we still need to act, and we need to act quickly. And I think that what we're dealing with at the moment with the COVID situation, and also, at least for where I work, the economic impact of a global COVID crisis, and that's the way things are playing out, particularly in East Africa, is that there aren't at least that many observed COVID cases, but the economies are just devastated, and that's having real impact on people's lives. And trying to respond, deal with the politics that leads to, and also deal with the institutions and how they can adapt and change in an agile manner, I think is really part of what I'd like to learn from the people in this group, and maybe see if I can share some of my experiences. I am going to cold call Dara Katz. I know that you in your institution are also working on these issues. So maybe if you have anything to add about the things that bring you most to this and how they're playing out in your institution. And maybe you can introduce yourself as well. Thanks.
Sorry, I seem to have lost the audio. Can people hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we hear you
Yeah,
just fine.
sorry, my
that.
computer
We-
doesn't seem to be liking two-way audio. But thanks to Jonathan. So for those who don't know me, I'm with USAID, working in our Center for Development Innovation. I'm not quite sure which thing Jonathan was pointing to, but I will say that I think as we've been looking, for instance, at the COVID situation, but also more generally of how to really pull in innovation and being innovative into the conversation inside the agency and how we do business with our partners. A couple things have become quite clear. Is one, I think OECD did a very good paper earlier this year of our own organizations really need to fully embrace this conversation about innovation and scaling. If we do not have the foundations in our own organizations, it's very hard for us to then work with our partners on the ground, private sector, country, civil society, social entrepreneurs, to achieve the outcomes we want if we don't have, some of my colleagues would say, the mindsets and behaviors and practices in our own organizations to go from pilot all the way to scale and adoption. So I think that's very important. Then the other thing I think that we are also looking at is how do you, last year when we were developing our Better Together challenge for Venezuela, the Venezuela crisis, how do we also bring together these concepts of operating in fragile and conflict-affected states with how do we innovate? They're two very different practices, but yet very similar, and they speak different languages. And so, and how do you kind of bring them together? And we even did a teach-in of each side teaching the other the different languages that they had, so then we could build an integrated model to really create a platform and for us operating in a dynamic way. And I think that's the third thing. I think also reconsidering how we think about partnerships. Our traditional partnership model is we're the development agency and we give money, whether it's to implementers or the country, and our beneficiaries are social entrepreneurs, innovators, governments. But maybe if we put ourselves in the middle rather at the top, then our conversation changes and we open the opportunities for new types of partnerships, both on how we support the scaling financially, and then how we also support and build that ecosystem to, as USAID would say, towards self-reliance. And so I think then you have a much more complex set on all a 360 opportunity for partnerships that really then enrich the conversation and really, I think, accelerate scaling.
Dara, thanks for that. And I smiled a little bit when you talked about not just trying to change the mindsets about how one can work more flexibly, be more agile in the places where we're operating in developing countries, in our partner countries, but also within our organizations. And I smiled because the World Bank, in some ways, like USAID, is a very large, often quite bureaucratic organization. We often draw an analogy to us being like a super tanker. And the good thing about a super tanker is it can carry a fair amount, but it isn't very agile in maneuvering through complicated terrain, complicated seas. And so figuring out how to keep our organizations not just talking the talk about being flexible and working in fragile settings, but also to walk the walk. That's a big challenge about the political economy of what we each are trying to do internally in our organizations. I hear you. I saw that there was a hand raised and it may have come down, but I'm sorry, I'm going to call you out. What did you put up your hand for? If you don't speak, I totally respect that. But we might unmic you for just a moment to see whether or not there was something that you wanted to say. Ruth Simmons, was this something that you wanted to say, or did you pull down your hand on purpose? I guess not. Sorry about that. No, so
Perhaps,
I wonder if, given those inputs, yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just going to say, I'm sure that Harsh Desai appreciated the shout out on the OECD's recent work on status of fragility. Harsh was on the team and part of the brain trust that created that report and the several working papers that went into it. So I might invite Harsh to say something about the kind of the new directions in which the OECD's work stream is going, perhaps around the DAC Nexus recommendation, or the fact of how the OECD over the last few years has kind of redefined concepts of fragility around risk and resilience, and contribute on that, Harsh. Before that, I just wanted to say to Dara, yes, that's exactly what I thought would be really great for everyone to hear, those points you made about trying to bring innovation into an ecosystem approach, trying to look at how we can strengthen systems types of approaches and not just be sort of one-off. There's so much received wisdom on scaling that looks at it as trying to have a winning pilot project or a breakthrough innovation. And once you have one of the other, then you try to scale it. And scaling for me is much more about trying to scale an outcome and bringing together different kinds of innovations and project models into a collective effort that can really tailor a countrywide intervention per geography, if it's disaster prone or conflict affected, etc. And so it's about bringing resources and political authorization and different kinds of implementing agencies and innovations into an overall effort to reach an outcome, not trying to scale one particular project across very diverse areas. So that might also help tee up maybe a little bit of what Harsh might like to say on the topic.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and great to join this session. So as many of you know, the OECD has been producing various iterations of the fragility reports or the states of fragility reports, and the most current iteration of the states of fragility reports and the OECD's multidimensional framework really started in about 2015 or 2016 with introducing sort of a multidimensional understanding of fragility that looks at the various risks and coping capacities to fragility across 5 dimensions: the economic, environmental, political, security related, and societal. And so it, I won't get too much into our methodology, but it is essentially trying to understand what those countervailing forces are in each dimension and across dimension to come up with our list of fragile contexts, or what we call our fragility framework. So when we're thinking about scaling, I think one element of this is to consider how the scaling can happen across the different dimensions, how donors can understand sort of the multidimensional implications of their work, and then also how the scaling could sort of work, across different sectoral and thematic priorities and across different geographic levels. So one thing that the States of Fragility 2020 report looks at is trying to move a little bit beyond the country or the context level and start to think a little bit about system-wide implications. So the sub-regional or regional, and really kind of how we can sort of understand global trends and currents in fragility. So that's one element, I think, of where we're thinking about scaling, and we don't have any answers yet, which is why we're quite excited to kind of be a part of this group. The other thing, as Jonathan mentioned, is of course the recent work on the humanitarian development and peace nexus. And actually, I should say that so I selected the first option on scaling interventions to bridge the humanitarian and development nexus, although I would say that peace is an integral part of that in fragile contexts. So we've been thinking quite a bit about the role of peace actors. There's quite a diverse set of peace actors. So the role of peace actors vis-a-vis others, and how we can kind of enable more coordinated and coherent approaches across these different types of actors. So there's that element as well of sort of identifying good practice or identifying kind of promising evidence of approach of sort of what a nexus approach might look like, and then trying to think about how that kind of approach could be applied across different contexts at different times. Of course, with the OECD and sort of the work that our team does, we're very much interested in thinking about kind of peer learning and scaling of approaches across donors that are part of the International Network on Conflict and Fragility. So just to sort of wrap up, I think a lot of our thinking is very much grounded in this kind of framing of risk and resilience. So, how can we use sort of approaches like the OECD's fragility framework to identify the risks, to identify the sources of resilience that can mitigate those risks, and then particularly how donors can then reinforce those particular coping capacities in a given context at a given time. And the work that, of course, social capital plays in that, just to refer to Jonathan's and Larry's work. So I'll sort of end there. There's, again, we don't have many answers just quite yet, but I think moving forward from this report that was released last month, we're quite keen to engage on this topic and kind of explore what it means to be fit for fragility in these contexts.
Thanks, Harsh, and really, what you said, particularly about thinking about peace actors, and I wouldn't mind if Harsh, if you can keep, Tracy, you can keep Harsh's mic on for a sec, just because I wanted to follow up. When OECD speaks about peace actors, I mean, that's a potentially overdetermined term. That is to say, are there one of the things the World Bank struggles with, as you can imagine, is that when we're trying to do COVID response or particular work in fragile settings, if we're going to work in places, and Alistair knows this very well from his experience being our country director in Afghanistan, we're going to need to operate with lots of different types of peace actors, or not always peace actors. If you're going to work in parts of Afghanistan, you need to make sure you are working with the local leadership. We are in several countries in East Africa needing to figure out how we as the World Bank can work well and closely with the security forces, one, to make sure that we do a lot of cash transfers, make sure that the security forces are making sure that those doing the implementation of these cash transfers are safe, but also that these resources aren't being misused. So when the OECD talks about peace actors, can you sort of unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll take an initial stab at it, but I will also suggest that you go read the chapter 2 of States of Fragility, as well as the background papers that contributed to that chapter on peace and fragility. And so I would say, we don't have a definitive answer as to what a peace actor is. Of course, we talk about the importance of peace actors for many of the reasons you outlined, in terms of enabling humanitarian access, in terms of working to negotiate political settlements, and kind of create sort of an enabling environment for development and humanitarian work, among other types of activities. And so for this particular version, we focused primarily on the work of peace builders, diplomats, and security actors. And by security actors, that of course also refers to a broad range of actors. So we're focusing more on sort of external security actors and, for example, peacekeepers. So I think, yeah, I think that's kind of the universe that we're working in. And I think a couple of things stand out. So one is, of course, the political nature of working on peace. And this is where potentially, diplomats diplomats at different levels. So of course, internationally, and then also locally in terms of mediation, can play an important role in kind of preventing violent conflict or working to reduce intense incentives towards conflict recurrence. So that's one element of it, of recognizing that it's a sort of a political and indeterminate world, and what it means to sort of work with that. And also kind of the second thing really is to shift the attention, and this is where we get back to the nexus of kind of from response to sort of more prevention. So we also have a working paper on conflict prevention, and one of the findings is that donors are giving 25% of their aid to fragile states towards humanitarian response versus only 4% towards preventing violent conflict. Now, there's nothing wrong with response. Of course, there's humanitarian need, but I think that if you sort of try to rethink what that approach might look like and try to rethink sort of the frameworks that we use for engaging in fragile states, and this is where the resilience work comes in, this is where kind of the thinking on scaling comes in as well, then, sort of a approach that prioritizes sort of what we call prevention always, development when possible, and humanitarian action when necessary is feasible and is something to aspire towards, I think. So I'll sort of just leave it there. I'm hoping that I answered your question, but if not, we can sort of send over some of our papers.
Thanks, Harsh. No, and you did, and I was giving you an opportunity to speak a little bit more about, I know some of the work that the OECD has done, and it actually gets me, and I'm sure others in the working group sort of thinking about that. There was a little bit of a technology hiccup, and I think that Ruth Simmons, in fact, did want to come in. And so Teresa or Matt, if you could unmute Ruth Simmons and her mic. And then after that, I'm going to ask April Knox to speak a little bit to some of the evidence gathering on working on these issues that J-PAL might be doing. So let's try one more time. And if you can unmute Ruth, that would be great. Thanks. And Ruth, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. I just wanted to say more generally why I like this working group so much, because while it's, your conversations sound like you're talking about Pacific countries that are in a fragile situation, but a lot of the conversation that you carry on is so relevant to all the other working groups. I work predominantly in the health group, but I feel that some of these conversations should be part of what we're talking about in these other groups as well. And you talk so well about these topics that's why I really appreciate having the opportunity to listen to what you're saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the appreciation. So let me now ask April to come in a bit on the latest research that J-PAL may be doing, or other reasons that she joined this working group. And then,
sure.
Yep. And then Susanna
Great.
after that.
Okay?
Yep, hear you just fine.
Great. Okay. So as Rob mentioned, I work at J-PAL, where I manage our work on crime, violence, and conflict. So for those of you who might not know J-PAL super well, we are a research center that uses randomized evaluations as a way of assessing the effectiveness of various social programs aimed at alleviating poverty in a broad sense. And so historically, you know, a lot of these randomized evaluations haven't really been taking place in fragile and especially conflict affected environments. So this is an area that we're increasingly trying to build research infrastructure up in to be able to answer critical questions in those locations. But even so, most of the work now that's actually happening in kind of FCD settings tends to be focused more on questions of how do you, you know, reestablish peace following conflict? How do you build social cohesion? How do you improve governance? So much more along those kind of thematic area lines. But I think we've seen less research in a lot of these environments on how do you promote health behaviors or how do you improve access to education, things of those nature. So definitely it's an area that I think we're seeing more and more research on, but historically there's been less. And so I think one of the challenges that we face at JPEL is thinking about, you know, we have a really robust evidence base from across a bunch of different sectors, but because a lot of that evidence comes from somewhat more stable environments, how do we think about actually taking that evidence and bringing it to a place that is affected by fragility and conflict and ensure that these programs are actually going to be effective in those environments? So usually the way we think about this is we have this generalizability framework that has like a couple different steps that we tick through to say, like, basically, if, you know, a government is thinking about implementing an education program and kind of comes to us and says, you know, what types of programs are effective, we'll kind of go to the evidence base and say, you know, these different approaches have been tested on different ways of kind of getting kids into school or improving learning outcomes. And so there's a fairly robust evidence base around certain types of interventions. And then we'll sort of do a context analysis of saying, okay, so we know the evidence on these interventions suggests they're fairly effective, but is the context similar enough where we think that actually this could work in this new environment? And so I think where this framework breaks down a little bit for us is that usually we're going from context to context that are fairly similar. Like, we wouldn't necessarily say that we should be trying an intervention in one place that's contextually completely different. And I think this tends to be a little bit more the case when we're thinking about adapting these programs into fragile settings. So I think this is an area that we still have a lot of open questions on, of thinking about, you know, what are the important questions that we really need to consider when taking something from a more stable environment to a fragile environment to make sure that the program's still going to be able to be implemented with fidelity. So those are some of the things that I'm just kind of stewing over throughout this conversation. But very interested to hear what others think. But thanks for including me in on all of this.
Thanks, April. And I think, I mean, I know JPEL's work very well, but those questions of external validity of, you know, if you found something in Kenya on deworming and you're trying to see whether or not it works in South Sudan, it's a lot harder to do. For instance, deworming is actually a terrible example, but if you're trying to do something that is very high touch, that takes a lot of involvement, that is training women on early childhood development work, and you're trying to do that in fragile settings, and you know that's high touch work, it's very hard to replicate even your experimental and measurement methods, but also to feel comfortable that what you might have found in one setting works well in another. So thanks for that. I have Susanna up next. And so Susanna, if or tech team, if you can unmute Susanna's mic, that would be great. Thanks.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay, greetings from Caracas. My English is not my first language, but I will try to share some ideas and also telling you how much I appreciate the chance to share with you and also to keep communications from such a complex scenario here down in Venezuela. I am actually running out of power in 10 minutes, but I will try to do my best. Well, first, I have a big interest in, I am the senior advisor to the humanitarian response of Caritas in Venezuela. I am a Venezuelan. I'm formerly a humanitarian practitioner from Oxfam GB, but I am now at my home country trying to do something here. So my first interest is regarding advocacy. Maybe first towards the UN system. There is a lot of issues running around the UN architecture, but the fact that the UN system is compelled to keep good relations with the government is creating sort of a lack of trust. So there is an extensive lack of trust among all the actors here, between the UN system and the civil society, between civil society and the government, between the government and the international cooperation. So it's so difficult to scale up in such a setting without enough trust. So I am wondering if there is any fragile state, any setting like that in which the UN system can work with a bit more of neutrality and be accountable to the people and not accountable to the state. Second is, I think that is important, the nexus between humanitarian and development agendas, but it's also central, and I have not more information on, the nexus between human rights and humanitarian. Sometimes being humanitarian, we are the ones that have the majority amount of evidence of human rights violations. But once we try to do human rights work, especially the UN and the diplomacy, just tack off saying that we are losing neutrality. So I am so interested in knowing any other experience around neutrality and how to be neutral from the from the humanitarian side in such a setting, facing huge human rights violations, especially for organizations like ours, that we have the double mandate of being humanitarian and also working towards the human rights. And third one is, diplomacy and how to work on advocacy towards the sanctions. International sanctions are worsening our humanitarian situation. The humanitarian situation here is deepening because of the lack of fuel. And so I am wondering how to do a good analysis of the context in which type of international sanctions are the ones that work the best in such a settings without worsening the humanitarian situation. So I have many more issues, but the two other ones are the issues on protection. I'm talking not only about the right to protect in regards to people, but also the protection of our NGOs, civil society, social enterprises. We are under a huge pressure in terms of criminalization. We have people in jail. It's an issue of security. not only integrity and physical security, but also the security of our communications, of our everything. And the issue of donors also. I think that this trend of donors on putting too much resources towards early assistance and also through the UN system is not supporting the idea of localization. So we need advocacy towards donors for managing funds, also for the protection of the social fabric and investing in putting the resources directly towards the civil society. But this is very difficult. I am wondering also because there is a matter of under finance or finance the
Absolutely.
humanitarian I mean, we have got almost finishing the year only 14% of the HRP for Venezuela. And it's because of the corruption and it's because of the human rights violations of this government. So how
Yep.
to rise the trust. And finally, the issue of diaspora. I fully support the idea of analyzing and getting support from the private sector, but I would appreciate information on diaspora-led emergencies because I'm sure that once the international cooperation undertakes the downsizing of the operations here, it will be an issue of the Venezuelan diaspora supporting us from the outside. Thank you so much. You are sort of a companion for us, and I will be in touch. Thank you so much.
Susanna, thank you so much for those excellent points. And there's before you sign off, please note that there's a paper that Jonathan has sent that Alistair worked on from ODI that speaks to some of the issues you raised, particularly about the United Nations. I think that no way that I could summarize your excellent contributions, except to say it really brings it home to when we're able to have someone who says, this isn't my first language, I'm calling from Venezuela, from Caracas, and my power might go out in the next 10 minutes. It really, when one speaks about the systems and institutions and making sure they work well, that in some ways is a representation of some of the issues we're dealing with, and making sure that one achieves neutrality, but also protects the people who are trying to do good work without that good work or those people being viewed as political actors is a very, very real challenge. Let me thank those who have participated in the conversation to date. If you didn't participate actively, I'm glad that you were listening. And if you have thoughts, please don't hesitate to send them either to the chat or to Jonathan and me more broadly. We'll be trying to keep a conversation like this going, particularly when we're talking about the issues that really animate this working group. Moving into the next phase of that conversation, or for the next hour, I want to hand back to Jonathan to introduce our speaker, Pallavi Roy, who will again keep us thinking about some of these issues. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Rob, and everyone who contributed to a great conversation. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Pallavi Roy, who will be our keynote speaker for the rest of the session. Pallavi is a lecturer in international economics at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Pallavi is also the research director for a very cutting-edge consortium funded by FCDO called ACE, the Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Consortium, which is doing fabulous work on anti-corruption that is both very adaptive and practical, but also deeply aware and embedded in political settlement approaches, and really trying to think through how interventions in particular sectors around governance challenges can over time try to support bigger movements for more inclusive political settlements. Pallavi is also a co-principal investigator for another FCDO funded effort on inclusive growth in Nepal, which also is quite fascinating work. And before all of these things, she worked in political consultants, risk consultancy in London, and was a finance journalist as well. So Pallavi, it's just a great pleasure to have you here with us today. We have circulated to our working group the recent paper that you did with Mushtaq Khan and the blog, but you now have a new paper that's also touching upon the issues we present today. So we'll make sure to get all of those things out to everyone that participated today. Teresa, if we could please load up the slide deck for Pallavi, that would be lovely.
Thank you.
And then over to you, a great welcome.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you to everybody for listening. You've already had a very interesting morning. I caught the tail end of it, some fascinating discussions, and really brought home the point to me that we as academics, where we are also very research heavy and work with a lot of policymakers, but when we look through the portals or towards you, community of practice, we often wonder, so what is it that really excites you? What are the questions that you're asking? What are the answers that you're looking for? And it was a very pleasant surprise to realize, especially through Jonathan, thanks to him for inviting me here, that we ask very similar questions, and sometimes we also reach fairly similar answers. Your experience would be very different. You are practitioners, you're on the ground, you're literally at the coalface. We come in at a sort of more secondary level, but I think what our research, and thanks to the SCGO, both with the SOAS anti-corruption evidence program and the work that we are doing in Nepal, we're actually working, sitting with practitioners, sitting with policymakers, and at the grassroots, at the sectoral level, really trying to figure out what are the feasible and impactful solutions. And these are the touchstones for us really in ACE, because there is no point in doing and designing very, very ambitious anti-corruption, which works very well on paper, is technically sound, but that which is not feasible, and if it's feasible, it's not impactful. So that really, I think, sums up for us the ACE framework, in something that we've also brought in to the framework paper on scaling that we've talked about. And you might wonder, how on earth can scaling be not ambitious? How on earth can scaling be feasible? It can certainly be impactful, but I'm hoping that the next 20 minutes at least tease out some of the questions, and then we'll have time for a lot of Q&A. So to begin with, Teresa, thank you so much for handling the slides. I have a few slide notes. I wouldn't have been able to do all of it. May I please have the next slide? The first one, rather. Great. Teresa? Sorry. Thank you. And if I can have just everything, yes, absolutely. Perfect. Thank you. So, yes, what is the governance challenge that we are facing as practitioners, as people who work on research in the sector? Now, the first assumption, of course, is that we have far less of an understanding of what will work ex ante in a fragile context. We have very little understanding or limited understanding of what is happening in developing country context because of the particular political economy of the transition they're going through, but certainly more so in fragile contexts, we have very little idea of what's going on. And the reason why we are also emphasizing on using horizontal networks in our framework is largely this: more so in fragile contexts, in context of weaker rule of law, you actually have a lot of informal horizontal networks being used for enforcement, far more than the vertical formal top-down hierarchy of formal institutional enforcement. So we actually thought one good way of making something feasible and having some chance of impact is to also start working with these informal horizontal networks. Of course, the formal mechanisms of state are definitely going to be a part of it. And we already know that as the pandemic has started to unfold, procurement and relief distribution processes are the most susceptible to corruption and leakages and inefficiencies. And this is not just in developing countries. I mean, we've had questions being raised about procurement processes right here in the United Kingdom. So when you're talking in the context of a fragile state where enforcement mechanisms are already weak, something like a pandemic and the demands on procurement and other kinds of efficient responses that are made on these formal mechanisms are actually under even more stress. And the other political economy aspect of fragile states is, of course, that there are some deeply embedded patronage and patron-client networks who in good times tend to corral all your contracts. And at these times, especially because of their higher relative power, tend to actually get the lion's share of most of the contracts, procurement contracts, or any kind of delivery mechanism that might give you an opportunity or give them and opportunity for rent capture. So that's the very adverse context. And being a good political economist, I've set it up in the most pessimistic manner possible. And you might be wondering, well, then what is the way out of this? And exactly because of the context that I just laid out, the scaling, the adaptive, and the sort of iterative framework that we've set out, we think is one way out of this adverse context that I've just described to you. Teresa, could we have the next slide, please? Right, now, how can scaling possibly help us with this particular governance challenge that we are talking about? Now, governance and corruption related constraints actually hinder scaling up. And that's largely because if you go via only the formal mechanism, the formal institutions, donors tend to go through the formal institutions far more, they're actually not set up to respond during an emergency like this. At the best of times, they have capacity constraints. At these kinds of critical times where you need a response that saves the maximum number of lives with unfortunately, the minimum of resources, that sort of setup is absolutely not geared to scale up very quickly and deliver. So an innovative anti-corruption approach, which involves mobilizing multiple providers for each delivery goal and delivery component of the treatment system, and not just relying on the public health system, is what we are talking about. That's why we think it's innovative. It's the fact that we are talking about mobilizing. It's the fact that we are talking about simultaneously mobilizing and scaling up what works and what doesn't work, and essentially building in a lot of redundancy. And I'm going to try and unpack all of this as we go along over the next few minutes. And in terms of the incentives behind why this might work, because at other times we see that the incentive for making something like this, which might sound a little complex, don't seem to exist. But the incentive here really could be the fact that we are in a national emergency, and that can actually provide the framework for cooperation that you need to achieve these kinds of rapid results. So that's the combination that we're really looking at. Achieving cost effectiveness while focusing on building redundancy. Now that's interesting. Some of you might already be wondering what it is that we are talking about here. But this is something, the cost effectiveness is actually because we are building in redundancy. And I'll be talking to that a little more later. Teresa, could we please have the next slide? Yes, if we can have all the figures, thank you so much. So this was a paper that we wrote early on in March when lockdowns were pretty much the order of the day. And we know that lockdowns are not so much part of the policy mix, but the lockdowns have actually become now for us a proxy of social behavior and the sort of social discipline that's required to counter a pandemic of this sort. The lockdown and what kind of lockdown strategy you have, or let's say, social disciplining, I won't use the word lockdown, the social disciplining or the behavioral response that you might have is very, very connected to the kind of treatment response or health strategy you might have. But both of these are extremely dependent on the governance constraints. And that's something that we tend to forget about. What are the governance constraints? They're not just the technical governance constraints, they're actually the political economy constraints of any kind of developing context, and certainly in a fragile state context, or even if you're talking in a relief camp. In the typical developing country, at the best of times, you will have absenteeism as a huge problem among primary healthcare centers. You will have primary healthcare centers, but they exist in brick and mortar. So at a time like this, your social behavior, your social disciplining strategy, how that's linked to your health strategy is seriously dependent on what your governance constraints are. And unless we think of these as a kind of continuum, interdependent continuum, we're not going to be able to get to the best kind of policy that you can use to respond to this kind of a pandemic. So Teresa, next slide, and then I can explain this a little more. Thank you. So what are the two components of a health strategy essentially? And first, of course, is that the behavioral response. That is, what is required for me to do? What does it mean in terms of enforcing social discipline? That's fairly obvious. And the treatment response is also fairly obvious, which is how do I use testing? How do I use tracing and quarantining? All of that is essentially part of the treatment response that we're talking about here. This pandemic, and this goes for pandemics, across time, pandemics actually impose externalities on society. And therefore they require a sense of social discipline. And when I mean they impose an externality on society, what do I mean? It basically means that there is a trade-off between private cost and social benefit. I might be young, I might not want to stay at home. I might want to go out because I know my risk levels are low. But if I'm out, there is somebody in another demographic who has to stay home. That's a very, very clear, obvious trade-off. There are also trade-offs based on the economic context that we talk about. So that becomes a huge issue to deal with. And even the most advanced country in the West, societies, politicians are finding it very difficult to tamp down in those kinds of societies. So social discipline is a problem even there. We just have a few East Asian countries which are outliers and have been able to impose some kind of social discipline, largely because they've had experience with pandemics before, whether it's been SARS or whether it's been the swine flu. But across the board in developed and developing economies, imposing that kind of social discipline is very difficult. Doing that in a fragile context where legitimacy is a question becomes even more difficult. And for very obvious reasons, the capacity for a high functioning treatment response is also low. And we're just not talking about in medical terms, we're actually talking about in terms of long-term economic and organizational capabilities. That just does not exist. And that becomes another critical issue. Next slide, please. Right. Now, how does all of this actually link to scaling up? Now, both behavioral response as well as a treatment response certainly have long-term determinants. There are historical power structures, there are historical capabilities building up. It's not something that has been built up overnight. But then for sure, these are actually variables that can be addressed with some short-term mechanisms. And that's what we are talking about pretty much here. What do I mean by these short-term mechanisms? And that's actually, if you think about it, health systems in most developing countries, in most fragile contexts, are for very good reason because their finance is very tightly controlled, is either donor-driven from the top or from the Ministry of Finance or driven by the Ministry of Health, which then goes right down to the public health system, to the primary healthcare system. But all of that is very hierarchical, very top-down, with the technical constraints as well as the political economy constraints that we are talking about. If within the context of these constraints, you ask such a system to scale up, that's not going to be possible. So what is the short-term way of ensuring success through scaling? It's by expanding the universe of organizations that you're working with and by defining treatment components that each of these delivery agencies are actually going to be working with. Now, social discipline can actually be improved in the context of an emergency response using community mobilization. And while Bangladesh has not used it during this pandemic, there have been organizations like BRAC that have actually gone out and tried to do this kind of mobilization. And in general, Bangladesh has been extremely successful with its public health response using community mobilization. One of the best examples, I'm sure all of you are very aware of it. But even in the context of very high levels of corruption and patron-client networks, it's actually possible to use multiple delivery networks. And this is something that we've actually managed to locate through some of our research in Uganda. We have a very sort of innovative healthcare pillar in the ACE research, and Uganda is one of the countries that our partners, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, are working in. And what's actually come to light is, even though the government has not licensed them yet, Uganda has a fair number of trained personnel who actually run or work in private drugstores, trained healthcare personnel who work and run private drugstores that the government has actually not come to recognize, but there is a high level of expertise there. And if the difference is a primary healthcare center which is shut and a private drug seller which has expertise, you can go to that person and she can be the first line of response for you in the context of, let's say, home care settings in the response to treating COVID-19. That can actually become a very successful delivery mechanism when the public health system isn't delivering. So it is possible to look for the widest possible, relevant, widest possible network, and then come up with the kind of organizations that actually would be able to deliver So we are implementing adaptive approaches of scale by joining up different organizations of different capacities, which are actually delivering different components of the healthcare system. And it's important to note that the reason why we're proposing this is that each provider has different strengths and weaknesses, and each of these can then be used to scale up and scale down. And that's the simultaneity issue that we are talking about. So of course, it needs a huge coordination mechanism behind it, but in fragile contexts, you also have donors, you have large NGOs. So it is actually possible to have a fairly robust coordination mechanism behind this. So you actually recognize the various strengths and weaknesses of these multiple delivery organizations and scale up or down simultaneously as is a requirement. Now, this is not something that will get rid of corruption. And at ACE, we tend to be very realistic about what kind of corruption we can address and how much of it we can address. And indeed, getting rid of all corruption in the procurement process should not be a priority during a pandemic response. The priority should be saving lives, using the least amount of resources in the best possible manner. Now, I know this sounds suspiciously like optimization, but this is really not the optimization strategy that we see in basically the kind of conventional economics textbooks. And that's largely because an optimization strategy requires for us to know the costs and benefits of each options. And in the context that we've just described of fragile governance, weak rule of law, we simply don't know all the parameters in those kinds of fragile contexts. And even finding out that information has a transaction cost. We tend to forget that these are not contexts of perfect information, full information, and zero transaction costs. Finding that information has costs, and it's not just technical information. This is really the political economy information of where are the leakages, where is the capture that's taking place. So for us, the fundamental question was, what is the strategy that generates the best information at the lowest transaction cost? Now, the standard sequential scaling up, which is we start small and we pilot up, we simply don't have the time for it. And that standard sequential scaling up, cannot control for changes in conditions over time, and it takes a long time. And in both cases, time is of the essence, given the kind of response that we are looking for. So therefore, our strategy of finding simultaneous channels might seem like we're building in a lot of costs, but that's the redundancy. And in fragile and weak rule of law context, we propose that that's really the best option for the lowest transaction cost approach that can actually generate the most appropriate information for us. Through the built-in redundancy that I am now talking about, we can actually identify what are the interventions that are working, what are the delivery agencies that are working, and start scaling them up. So in that sense, it's not the lean cost effectiveness that we are talking about, but it actually allows us to identify through the creation of deliberately building in redundancies, the kind of delivery agencies and the kind of interventions that are working for us, allows us to scale them up, deliver more effectively, and therefore become more cost effective. May I have the next slide, please? So as I said, the judgment on the mix of health interventions is therefore very, very critical in this ability to scale up fast. If I don't identify what I can scale up with, I'm actually falling short on the kind of interventions that I can provide. Now, it is integrated because we are looking at connecting all the health interventions. Essentially, this has to be an iterative process. It's not a sequential one. And when I mean all the processes, it's not just talking about the medical or the clinical processes. And I'll talk to it in the last slide when we actually propose some of the alternative mechanisms and how these networks might matter. But just to give you a very small example here, it's not just about testing and tracing and going door to door, for instance, using a community network. One possible intervention might be, in certain cases, to impose a kind of small localized lockdown when infections are ripping through a particular community. You might want to then mobilize a local transport agency to deliver either medicines or food in the context of home quarantine. So we're even talking about those kinds of interventions that, if are necessary, will need to be looked at. It is adaptive because some links in the chain might work, networks rather in the chain might work and might not work. But we think this is going to work because a lot of people might say there is a multiplicity. But again, in the kind of context that we are talking about, in fragile context, you have capacity constraints to begin with. So therefore, the number of interventions is in any way finite, and the number of organizations and networks that you're dealing with relevant to the COVID-19 context are also constrained. So therefore, it is a finite universe on both the counts. So it should be possible for us to design this kind of a scalable matrix system. So this is essentially what we're talking about. And important to note that cost effectiveness is achieved because of built-in redundancies. And I think that is something that I also explained in the last slide, but just to go into a little more detail here, the true cost of an extra bed or testing kit is not just the direct cost of it. It also very much includes the cost of corruption, if I may say so, the cost of the leakage or the procurement. So mobilizing multiple providers for each goal can actually generate incentives for players to be cooperative and work towards a common national strategy. And that is, to us, the cornerstone of what we are talking about and why we are saying this is cost-effective redundancy. And that's not a contradiction in terms. Think about it like you're building a table which is supposed to withstand an earthquake, or is supposed to be durable. Let's say not withstand an earthquake, but you want to build a table that's durable and can stand on its 4 legs, and you use inferior ply. And when an earthquake comes, it collapses. But if you build it with slightly better material, and when an earthquake comes along, which is what the pandemic almost feels like, the shocks just don't stop coming, the table is actually able to survive and stand. And so so in the long run, or even in the short to medium term in our response to the pandemic, it's actually a very cost-effective way of looking at it, scaling up. May I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is just visually mapping out what I've just talked about. You can see it's essentially you identify potentially feasible networks. If you can see this close enough, I possibly can't, you'll have to strain a little bit. You assign catalyst organizations, the coordination mechanism, and most importantly, identify the redundancies. That's when you identify the most cost-effective arrangement, and simultaneously you start scaling up. And this diagram, for those of you who are interested, is available in a World Development a piece that's just come out. It's not an article, but it's a letter that the World Development published, and it's available there. It really encapsulates the sort of adaptive integrated scaling mechanism that we're talking about in our framework. Next slide, please. And I'll quickly end. I know that we don't have time. I'm probably running a little over time. But yes, so this gives you an idea of the conventional delivery system. I've graded out because it's conventional. There's finance, which is the donor or the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Health. The response and coordination functions are across various ministries and line agencies, and the agencies delivering treatment are also very, very linked to the central government or the relevant line ministry. And I've said this before and I'll repeat this, but the chief constraint in this, in terms of delivering the scale that's required and the effective response that's required, is the capacity constraint and the governance constraints. It's just not possible for something that's so hierarchical and has so many constraints to scale up and deliver. It's not fit for purpose in that sense. It has to be complemented. This is not about bypassing the conventional healthcare system. There is absolutely no way in fragile contexts that you cannot work with whatever formal institutions of the state, but it's about complementing, and it's about increasing the scale. Next slide, please. And this looks more closely at what an adaptive and a horizontal sort of matrix network might look like. So you still have the same functions. You still have the financing function, the very, very important coordination function, the delivery function. And then we also have something called treatment components. It's not just about what are we delivering. It has to be broken down into very specific treatment components. So you have a treatment component at the community level. This is where social discipline might come into play. And we've done some work, or certainly are aware of some work happening in Dhaka and in areas like Dharavi in Bombay, in India. Dharavi is possibly the second largest slum in Asia. And in at least the initial infection wave in India, in Bombay, which was one of the hardest hit urban areas in the country, they actually managed to control a lot of the infection in Dharavi precisely through this kind of a scaled up approach. It wasn't something that was planned, but it was something that was much more intuitive. It brought in community workers. It brought in local doctors who had private practices and had generations long relationships with residents of the slum. It had local religious leaders. It had NGOs who were supplying food during quarantine. So in one sense, it was a sort of kernel for the idea that we are talking about here. So yes, the treatment component could be at the community level. It could be home care, which we think should become increasingly important because this pandemic isn't going to leave us in some time. And even if there is an effective vaccine, by the time it reaches all our developing and fragile contexts, it's not going to be sometime very soon. So home care should start becoming more and more important. You, of course, have primary care, and then there is the behavior response. So what would an alternative mechanism look like? Now, if you possibly looked at the black line that I'm talking about, there's financing coming from the central government. It might be given to a local NGO. The local NGO works with medical students in the local university, local medical university. This is to design some kind of home care protocol, and the home care protocol might need that you actually, for people to actually want to stay home, for people to be comfortable to stay home, you might need to deliver food, essentials, and medicines, for which you actually need to link up with the local transport agency. And you will see that there is another black line which leads up and joins together with working with the local medical students for home care. So that's an example. The red line is another similar example. You use community organizations and smaller NGOs to work in terms of behavior response, which needs some kind of community orientation. So these are just ideas. I'm not a healthcare expert. This is something that we kind of worked through with our thought through looking at the experience of the pandemic in Nepal and Bangladesh. For us, it was important to put the idea out there that scale is important because time is of the essence. Scale does not mean that you're adding extra cost. It actually means this is being cost effective. And we're also talking about an adaptive program that allows you to scale up or wind down as is required. What is extremely important is the role of the coordination agencies, which could be the catalyst organizations that we've listed here, obviously the donors. And we think that the emergency of a pandemic gives us the kind of, not us, but gives these organizations on the ground the kind of incentive to come together, which otherwise might have been captured by various kinds of rent seekers. And why this gives us at least a short to medium term window to address the sort of conditions created by the pandemic. And if you're lucky, if some of these delivery mechanisms actually stick, it might in the long term actually help in progressing the healthcare system better by having some of these as permanent features of the healthcare system. So I'm going to stop here and hope that you have some questions for me. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pallavi, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. This is a very elegant presentation of some concepts and ideas that we've been talking about within this working group for the last couple of years, with an emphasis on the idea that scaling should really be outcomes focused, not focused on a particular project or particular intervention, but how do we actually create a network focused on outcomes, coordinated across multiple types of implementing partners, government agencies, financing investors and institutions, such that we can move collectively towards an outcome in a way that helps us find the critical path, find a path that is the most effective, but also that builds resilience into this. And so the points that you incorporate into this on building redundancy as part of the cost effective and the overall effectiveness of the program, I think really resonates. So thank you very much for the presentation. And I'll open it up to comments. Alistair, I think you started a trail in the chat, but I can invite you to actually make the points verbally if easier. So if you'd like to make a comment or pose a question, please raise your hand with the button and then we'll get to you. Can we have Alistair's mic unmuted, please? And then Larry will come to you next.
Sorry, I need to unmute my own mic. No, thanks very much, Pallavi, for I thought a really fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. I mean, this was really excellent, and I like the phrase "cost-effective redundancy." That's something I really take away from this. And I think what you said resonates a lot from my own experience in Afghanistan. And I think dealing with fragility generally, you know, people are under a lot of pressure to generate results. And indeed, when we start looking about conflict prevention, has a lot of parallels with dealing with the COVID crisis and the possibility for learning from our response from this crisis to think about more how we can institutionalize the prevention of violent conflict. I'd make several points. I mean, why this resonated with me, I think, is first of building on what's there rather than trying to create new institutions or organizations from scratch. And I think that's really important in a crisis situation. I think the other thing I think you came out quite clearly, which again links with my own experience, is this whole problem of taking collective action, you know, particularly in societies which are quite individualistic. And as I've spent half of this year in New Zealand and half in the United States, you know, I really, you know, see these issues very starkly. But you know, you mentioned Bangladesh, and I mean, when I was doing rural electrification in Bangladesh, we found that, you know, rural society can take community collective action. And if you go to the community level, you can often solve problems that are impossible to solve at the national level because of the dynamics of society. I think one point I would make is on procurement. And again, that's been a huge challenge in the World Bank. And in the case of the health sector in Afghanistan, what we decided to do was essentially, there were NGOs providing health services all over the country, and to have a system of franchises that they had to bid for. So as well as, so it was a very simple bidding. And from my infrastructure experience, you can simplify the procurement for a massive power station just by going out to bid on the price of electricity, you know, so many cents per kilowatt hour. It's as simple as all that. Whereas getting into all the details of the costs and things, you've got massive opportunities for corruption. And I think it is possible to have fairly rapid procurement, even in a crisis situation, perhaps not as crisis as COVID, if you're procuring the right things. And I would argue it's outputs, outcomes, if you can construct it that way. And there's a lot of lessons from infrastructure procurement on how to do that. The other big point I'd make is this issue, two more points. One is this issue of sustainability. And there's a whole history of temporary measures becoming permanent. Now, this actually may be a way of actually coming up with the kind of sensible organization of the health sector in any case, but it may be worth having that in the back of our minds going forward, because you look at the global humanitarian system, which Susanna was being critical of. I mean, that in a sense came from response to crises which required rapid action, although the crises have tended to become prolonged, and it's become the kind of default set of arrangements. So I think there's that issue of sustainability. And the last one is, at the end of the day, there needs to be some kind of evaluation, screening, which of these multiple providers work best, which are the ones we want to nurture for the future, and which in a way are shall I say, failures. And being able to penalize the failures, to stop doing things in international development, is extraordinarily difficult. Let me stop there.
Do you want me to respond to any of this, or because this was really a series of very complimentary comments, because I agree.
Let's perhaps, I suggest, take Larry's comments as well, and then you can take them.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. Can we please unmute Larry?
Pallavi, I too enjoyed the presentation very much. Thanks so much for it. My question comment sort of speaks to something that you mentioned, but then slid over fairly quickly, I think, which is the issue of coordination. And for me, coordination is no easier than hierarchy. In fact, in some ways it's harder than hierarchy, because hierarchy we're kind of hardwired for, and systems tend to know what to do with hierarchy, and they tend to be less good at being systematic about anything horizontal. And even if it's something like letting 1,000 flowers bloom, that not kind of what's implicit in what you're saying. There's a little bit more orchestration than that implied in what you're talking about, even if it's through a wide number of delivery points on this. And Jonathan and I have debated, discussed, and struggled with this issue of coordination, and looked at a number of different models in different countries, depending on just in what way they're fragile. Because some places are fragile, but still have a basic governmental structure that functions, and others it's broken down altogether. Pick a Somalia, for example. So when you start thinking about that collaboration structure, I think something this group could do, and something I would be glad to hear from you on now, is just how we can push the envelope on that. Because I think the farther we can go in helping people think about possible approaches to that problem, the more approachable this horizontal strategy and redundancy becomes, without simply saying we're giving up the idea of doing this in a systematic way at all.
Thanks, Larry. Over to you, Pallavi.
Thank you, Larry. Absolutely bang on. It might have been completely psychological and subconscious. I skipped over it simply because it's difficult to answer, but you're right. That is essentially the nub of things. And if you notice in the matrix that I presented, that's part of our framework, we also have something called catalyst organization in that same coordination pillar. And I think one way of going around that, and I'm sure this has been tried, might not work in all contexts, but in some contexts, it might actually be possible to choose a catalyst organization which is dealing from your, the standard coordination agency, whether it's the Ministry of Health or any other large NGO maybe in a refugee camp situation, but identifying a large enough catalyst organization with enough legitimacy and buy-in, which can, for at least the next year and a half, be the kind of entity which coordinates among the different horizontal agencies, has some kind of M&E oversight, something that Alistair also talked about. And I completely agree with the monitoring of what doesn't work is as important. So coordination will certainly make or break this, but I think the idea was also to start building a conversation around moving beyond the silo of the public healthcare system. That doesn't solve the problem of coordination, but this was much more an idea using the framework to get that conversation started, that we actually need more than what is available to us within the public health system or the centralized government formal institutional system. So the catalyst organization was placed there with an idea to really tease out that coordination is important, and they are invested with the functions of it. It's going to work out differently in different contexts. It would be more successful in some, it would be less successful in others, but we need to find some way of finding that particular coordination agency. Otherwise, this framework isn't going to be successful. And we're absolutely clear about that. And the next line of research, when it becomes operational, this is still a framework, but this has to be operationalized. And I think the task of operationalizing is really how you identify that coordination mechanism and work with the catalyst organization. The point very well taken, Larry. Thank you.
And do you want to respond to any of Alistair's points?
Actually, you know what? I agree with all of them. Outcomes-based, not input-based. I mean, in the electricity sector, it is still possible to game. I mean, I do a lot of work in Nigeria, and you can put an output-based benchmark out there, and you can still fail, and the country will still not produce enough electricity. But I think in a pandemic kind of situation where you need an emergency response, you can actually find, given the sort of public healthcare impetus behind it, you can actually find a lot of organizations which will respond to the output-based compulsion. That could certainly work. The sustainability of interventions for us, and I did kind of, I think, mention, though it was in passing, for us, one of the long-term aims would also be whether this kind of, an iterative system can actually be cemented into the public healthcare delivery system. And therefore, then it becomes more sustainable. Some of the interventions might actually be very good for communicable diseases that are still very important in African and South Asian contexts. And the monitoring of what works is extremely, extremely important, rather more of what doesn't work, because these are also very sort of rent thick areas of operation. Public healthcare has always been extremely rent thick. So the monitoring is a very critical part of it, and links back to the point of the Catalyst Agency. Can that be given the monitoring function? Yeah.
Very good. If anybody would like to pose a question or make a comment, please raise your digital hand and we'll get to you. Two comments in the meantime while we're waiting. One is that I see a lot of application of this work in emerging approaches for resilience outside the traditional sector of food security. So USAID, for example, has now launched a lot of new work on resilient health systems in fragile states. And it's, as you say, Pallavi, looking at how do you bridge the formal and the informal system together? How do you bring a much wider set of partners together around this? So I see a lot of application for this, and I'll actually come to you separately to talk about something that we're planning with USAID on this front. The other thing I think that I observe is that this is sort of the long-awaited sort of next generation of thinking following on work that, for example, the basic package on health services in Afghanistan, which had some precursors in Cambodia and Bosnia before that, but this attempt to build catalyst organizations and support around the Ministry of Health for a very large network of partners to go off and do primary healthcare in very different places in Afghanistan. So some of them were conflict affected, dealing with insurgency. Others were just drought affected, dealing with displacements. And they actually managed this basic package to reach its MDG goal of cutting infant and maternal mortality in half by 2015. So it's a really interesting model. Larry and I, in some of the work we've done, have tried to suggest or recommend how we can incorporate resilience types of work into something this big, as well as trying to change the patterns of cooperation and inclusion within that process. So trying to get some of the root causes of risk. But I think what you've given us now is a really rich framework from which to think about this and rooted in some recent experiences around Bangladesh and Nepal. So we're really pleased that you could share this with us. Rob, please. And I actually mentioned too that Rob had worked on the basic package during time in Afghanistan, and Alistair was the head of fragility for the World Bank for a number of years, and was actually the country director in Afghanistan during that time. So we've got some veterans of that program here. Rob, over to you.
No, Pallavi, thank you. Excellent presentation, and really nicely summarizes a lot of the thinking. And my questions are as much just to sort of push you a little bit to expand, because I know that we specifically asked you to speak about the COVID case, and that's obviously what's front of lots of people's minds. And I guess I wondered whether, as you've been pulling together some of this work and think about, for want of a better way of describing it, how much matters the sector or that you're working on? By which I mean, I think the health example is marvelous, and it's topical right now in COVID. And I think, just as Alistair and Jonathan have said, this model of it's not quite let 1,000 flowers bloom, but it's to make sure that you use whatever redundancies, whatever actors are available, without as much worry about redundancy, but more interest in coverage in the health sector. That really works nicely. I did a paper when I was working on Afghanistan that sort of looked at the contrast between how the health sector operated in Afghanistan and the way the education sector operated. And Alistair may be able to speak to this more poignantly, because I think he was probably in the room where it happened. But what was so interesting is this notion of setting up contractual models to allow healthcare operators to achieve results in certain locales according to a contract. Importantly, and this gets a little bit to Larry's question about coordination versus hierarchy, there's a principal agent relationship that's being set up between government and healthcare provider that I think is an important aspect to keep in mind. I'm not saying it has to be deeply hierarchical, but there does need to be some contracting going on. Any of that contracting in health was an idea the government took on without trouble. they did not take it on in education. And part of that is, and there were plenty of education providers, but part of what is obviously different in the education sphere when working in fragility is that a big role of the government, of the sovereign, is in some ways to try to make sure that everyone is educated with the same history, language. You know, there's more nation building and subjectivity of nation building in education than there is in health. I wonder if you've thought a little bit about the way these different models might work in different sectors. Over to you. Oh, and one other thing, the food security sector is one that I work with a lot in the Horn. And again, how much could this work potentially in the food security sector? Just to think a little bit about elaborations on your talk. Over.
We really focused our attention on the healthcare sector because that's where we were working. But now that you talk about it, I really don't think that the structure of the education sector is also set up in a manner that would find this framework extremely useful, because there are not as many discrete moving parts in the education sector. It's a lot more centralized, it's more lumpy. Investments in education tend to be more lumpy, whereas in health, you know, there's a bit of both. You can have, yes, of course, your tertiary hospital, your primary healthcare center, but there are also other satellites within that whole thing, because we're also talking behavioral response. And this is much more, since we're talking behavior here, healthcare is much more suited to, you know, bringing in aspects of behavior and that kind of enforcement than education. There is a limit. There is an element of behavior, of course, but not as pronounced as we have in healthcare. And in education, you're also talking about some fairly, I would imagine, and I'm really thinking, you know, I would have said on my feet, but I'm sitting down, but I'm really thinking as I'm sitting down now. The social norms in education are also extremely different and it's fairly more difficult to dislodge, because the incentive structure of the social norm around education is very different from the incentive structure around the social norm in health, where it could be more easy to change because you're talking about something where you're talking about mortality and death and you know, handicaps, etc. So it might be easier to address. In education, it's not. So the structure of the two sectors is very different. Food, I certainly can see from my experience in Nigeria, for instance. You know, when you're talking about food security, you're not just talking about seeds and farmers. You could be talking about fertilizers. You could then be linking it right back to, let's say, indigenization of the manufacturing process for fertilizers. There's a whole ecosystem there, which would actually work very well and would work with this kind of a framework. I wouldn't quite think education would fit the kind of framework that we are talking about. So yes, there are definite sectoral implications here when talking about this framework. Totally, now that I'm thinking about it. Thanks, Rob.
Pallavi, Alistair asks in the comments how you see cash transfers as a way of potentially getting around some of the corruption and capacity constraints and potentially helping to bridge towards more permanent social protection systems, safety nets, etc.
Okay, I'll do the typical academic thing here, Alistair, and plug a paper that Mushtaq and I have actually written on this. It's on the ACE website. It's on digital identities and not so much on cash transfers, but digital identities and social protection. And like good academics, we have a 2x2 framework on it. But and the framework essentially does say that what matters is the relative holding power, because we come from a political settlements background, is the relative holding power of somebody who is actually implementing that digital social protection system. Now, you're talking about cash transfers, of course, you're not talking about digital, and cash transfers definitely work. When you're talking about an emergency response, when you're talking about shocks, cash transfers are a very, very good way of smoothing the shock to the system. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And countries which, for instance, Africa has actually done very well, and I'm sure a lot of you, on this panel would have already known about that, but close to about 40 odd African countries have already tried cash transfer-based social protection systems, and it has gone a fairly long way in terms of buttressing the shock from the lockdown. In Africa, it's not been so much the health consequence, it's been the economic consequence of the lockdown. So that has certainly definitely worked. And there will always be ways to game the system. Nothing can be completely 100% leak proof, especially in the context that we are talking about. It's always possible to get a fingerprint, a thumbprint, or you know, even get a biometric card of somebody and claim on her or his behalf. So it's not going to be as foolproof. If it can go directly into a bank, like a direct benefit transfer, that can actually work very well. Some countries like Kenya, even Nigeria and Ghana have made some progress in that. So absolutely, they can work. If they go straight into bank accounts, they work even better. Digital identities can be a bit of a problem, but I'm not going into that right now. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Pallavi. We'll be sure to add the digital identities paper as well to the Senate that we'll do to the group afterwards. And thank you once again. We really appreciated the time, the presentation, the insights. It's been great. And we'll, I'm sure, stay in touch, because I'm sure there are a lot of people in the group that have been highly stimulated by this. So thank you very much. We are near the end, friends, of our 2-hour session. So I'll just say a few things parting, and then I'll give it to Rob for the last word. We really encourage those who are new to the COP and to the working group to join if there's interest, and to see the group as one in which we'll host quarterly meetings. We have a newsletter that comes out. We're in the 18th version of that right now. But also to see it as a place where, if you would like to host your own session under the auspices of the group, you want to brainstorm on something with this diverse group of partners, or you want to host somebody that has an insight that you want to tease out, feel free to use the group in that way as well. And please do sign up either through Rob, myself, or Larry for the group. And we look forward to being in touch in the next few months for the first meeting coming up. Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks, Pallavi, again, for a really exciting, stimulating conversation. And it's so topical as to the kinds of issues that we're grappling with, and can see that you're grappling with, and look forward to having you and your work sort of weave through some of those conversations that we have. I also want to thank the participants who joined today for adding to the conversation, for bringing their own perspectives, and from sort of helping to give me a sense as a newcomer, as a newbie, as it were, to better understand the types of issues that working group members are interested in, but also importantly, the sort of depth of the breadth of engagement, and the different ways in which people come at these same issues, but also the depth of the conversation that comes from bringing together different parts of the community, be it academic, be it donors, be it implementers or NGOs or think tanks, to think productively about these types of crucial issues on scaling up in fragility. And just as Jonathan said, really look forward to having folks participate in this conversation at our next meeting, but also virtually between meetings, and really grateful for your joining this morning. So let's, with a thanks to the technical people who did a great job of keeping everything moving smoothly, and my co-chair and educator on this, let's sign off now, and thanks again for joining us today. Over.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.